Um, Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's my absolute privilege to welcome the former President of the UN General Assembly, an esteemed academic who has been the Professor of Practice in Politics at the University of Sciences Po. He was the youngest foreign minister in the world at the time of Serbia, and is an experienced intellectual, politician, and practitioner of politics as well. It's my privilege to welcome Vuk Jeremić. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this most kind introduction.
So just to outline briefly the format of the event, Mr. Jeremić will start off with an address, and then I'll fire off a few questions based on this, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So, without further ado, Mr. Jeremić.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, and thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I really feel privileged and a bit emotional because this is the 30th anniversary, actually almost to the day, that I set foot for the first time in Cambridge. That was for my undergraduate interview at Queen's College, and a great many things happened since. I'm back in Cambridge. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the privilege to share my worldview with you, because I understand we're supposed to talk about what awaits us in 2024 as the international community. I'd like to start off by, again, like a time travel to '94 when I came first to Cambridge. It was a very different time. One of my friends liked to say back then, when we said Amazon, we meant the rainforest, and when we were saying apple, we meant fruit. So it was like ages ago. But I remember I came to Cambridge, and I remember at that time the world, or the Western world, let me be more precise, celebrating the end of history. The end of history was a concept launched famously by liberal philosopher Francis Fukuyama of Stanford University. It referred to the end of the Cold War, which meant the final defeat of communism or any kind of autocratic regimes. It was the victory of liberal democracy, victory of capitalism, and the history was going to come to an end, and we'd no longer have world frictions. And I remember that was the year when Nobel Peace Prize went to Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, and who was the third one? It was Shimon Peres, if I'm not mistaken. They shared the Nobel Peace Prize for the everlasting peace in Palestine. And I remember it was a big thing. It was Queen's trip to Russia. The very first time, it proved to be the last one, but like, at least until now, but it was the very first time that a British monarch would visit Russia. And that was also part of the end of history. And I remember Budapest Memorandum was signed, which guaranteed the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine forever, as a matter of fact, despite the giving up of the nuclear arms, the Soviet nuclear arsenal that was transferred to Russia. Anyway, the idea was that we were not going to have geopolitical frictions anymore. Now, for us from the Balkans, it sounded a little bit ridiculous because we were at that time going through a devastating war. It was probably even more ludicrous to people from Africa, especially in Rwanda and Burundi, because there were certain developments there that could not really rhyme with the idea of the end of history. But nevertheless, I think that was a historical moment which is not uncommon in history. that came after like a big conflict or like a very, very tense period where a conflict comes to an end and there is a belief that there will be no more problems of that sort. So the end of history illusion was shared by the contemporaries of the Congress of Vienna in 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars. It was shared by the contemporaries of the Versailles Peace Agreement that ended the First World War, and it was surely shared by the signatories of the San Francisco Declaration that led to the creation of the United Nations, the San Francisco Charter, the Charter of the United Nations. They all thought that history was going to come to an end, and they all assumed that the alliances that emerged victorious from the previous conflicts were going to stay intact, and that they are going to be continuing to setting the rules and norms of whatever comes in front of us for time immemorial. So ending of the Cold War, which coincided with my coming to Cambridge, was like one of those moments where there was an illusion, a collective illusion that the history was going to come to an end. Now, we know now very well that history has not come to an end. We, as a matter of fact, live in an era of a very deep geopolitical recession. And when I say recession, I mean, people usually refer, when they say recession, they almost instantaneously think of economy. So recession is a very well-known term in economy. It's easily calculated. We all know what it means. But I'd like to assert this idea that geopolitics is also cyclical, just like economy. It comes in cycles. The periods of booms are followed by the periods of bust. The only difference is that the geopolitical cycles tend to be much longer. In economy, cycles are like 2 years, 3 years, maybe 4 years. When it comes to a depression, could be longer, but recession or boost tends to last for a couple of years. In geopolitics, it tends to last for decades. I fear we are right now in a teeth of a geopolitical recession, and the year 2024 is probably going to be the lowest point so far of this negative geopolitical cycle. Is that going to prove to be the trough? Well, that I don't know, that I'm not prepared to swear on. But that this is going to be the lowest point so far, I'm prepared to argue for that. And there are multiple crises going on right now, but I'd start off by denoting three, which I think are the most consequential. 3.5, maybe 4. But the three that we do know that are unfolding in front of our eyes, I'm going to start off by saying the United States domestic politics. The United States domestic politics in 2024 is going to be so much of a crisis situation that is going to influence so many other developments in the world. And I start off by saying the United States because I think it's probably the most consequential what will happen there. The second one is currently the most tragic one going on, and this is the Middle East. The third one is the war in the east of Europe, which is Ukraine. And the fourth one, the 3.5, I'll come to explain why I think 3.5, is a black swan event of 2024. And in geopolitical recessions, the probability of a black swan event is much higher than in normal times, in times where there is no recession. So ever since the beginning of this recession, I think we had black swan events happening at an almost annual basis. So I would personally give a 50% probability to a black swan event. And if you ask me what would be a black swan event, then, I mean, I have to say like, I don't know, because if I knew, this would not have been a black swan. So those three crises, completely intertwining, and the 50% of a black swan, which makes it a 3.5, if you will. Crisis is what's gonna dominate the headlines, what's gonna influence our lives in 2024. So I'll very quickly run through what I mean by these three crises, and then we can get into the Q&A. I'll start with the United States. I feel very privileged to be here, and I'm sure this is a very knowledgeable audience. And I remember in September of last year, it was in the margins of General Assembly. I gave a lecture in an environment similar to this. And I said, I actually predicted that Donald Trump was going to become the president of the United States in 2024. And I wasn't really booed, out of the room, but I did not make too many friends in the room at that moment. It was, the very much of a multilateralist crowd on the margins of the UN, or they all believed in things like international cooperation. So my saying that I would probably put my money on Trump becoming the president was not music for everybody's ears. But I said, this is what I believed at that time was going to happen. I think it's now much more visible, imaginable, that this is a scenario. I think Mr. Trump wins the nomination, wins the GOP nomination in a matter of days, maybe weeks. I would say the end of February at the latest. He becomes the nominee. He immediately gets the entire GOP, the Republican Party, behind him. So no more opposition, no more big wigs of the party, no more centrist Republicans at that stage. That is the moment when what Donald Trump says, this is the policy of the Republican Party, and essentially one half of the body politic of America taking it up. And now you may like or you may not like what he says, but this becomes politics of America, half of America, with a good chance of actually becoming the executive office of the US government in 2025. Now, the problem with that is that this is seen as an existential threat by the other half of the body politic in America. And we're coming to an impossible situation, impossible to imagine a situation only a few years ago. It would have been impossible that one half of the political spectrum in the leading democracy and the most powerful country of our times, most powerful economically, most powerful militarily, in so many other ways as well, comes to a situation where one cannot easily imagine transfer of power, or at least not imagine the accepting of the outcome of the election by whoever loses the election. And from my conversations with people in the American political circles, there's a very, very deep conviction that whoever loses this election is going to be prosecuted, is going to be given a hard time, legally, financially, by the FBI, by the IRS, by the DOJ, and it's not only Donald Trump. For Donald Trump, it's obvious. I think if he doesn't win the election, there's a very big question as to how all these legal cases against him are going to end. And he personally believes that he's going to go to jail if he doesn't become president of the United States. But believe it or not, like there are a number of people in Biden administration that believe they're going to be having a hard time if Trump wins. So the stakes have never been higher, and the two sides of the American political spectrum, they're barely talking to each other. It's not like that there's any diplomacy going on between them at this moment. They have radically different versions of truth. And part of my class at Sciences Po actually started off by saying, what is the truth? It's very important to understand what is truth in international relations. And my formula is that truth equals facts plus context. So it's not just facts, it's facts plus context. And therefore you can end up with different versions of truth. And it's not to say that like one truth is more legitimate than the other. Of course, you are most closely related and married to your version of truth, but it'll be good when you deal with international affairs to be able to understand other alternative truths. Not buy them, not believe in them, but understand where they come from in order to be able to more efficiently deal with the situation where there's division and problems of any sort. So in American political system right now, there are radically different versions of truth, of one side in comparison to the other. And that's worrying. I mean, somebody's going to win these elections in 2024, but I'm almost sure that the other side is not going to take the loss easily. And I'm not talking about 2000, when you had like a Supreme Court discussing about hanging chads and whatnot, and in the end of the day, Al Gore recognizing the result of the election by recognizing the ruling of the Supreme Court, as a matter of fact. That was the Bush versus Gore case in the United States. I think something deeper and something more complicated may be going on. So that's the number one source of risk and instability in 2024. The second one, perhaps more obviously, is what is going on in the Middle East. A lot of people that I talked to called the events of October 7, the outrageous terrorist attacks that took place in Israel and Gaza, they would call it the Black Swan event. For those who are following Middle East perhaps a bit more closely or for over a longer period of time, not everybody would call it the Black Swan event, but it did contribute in a very significant way to the profound instability of not just the Middle East, but the whole world, bringing into question big picture diplomacy, economy, and so many other issues that are high on the list of international leaders. In short, I don't think that the war in the Middle East can come to an end in 2024. There could be pauses. I'm not sure how lengthy those breaks can be. But the fundamental parameters of what led to this devastating conflict, which is so cruel, so bloody, it's shocking for everybody who's watching this. The fundamental parameters are such that one cannot imagine this coming to an end in 2024. Again, the radically different versions of truth are at stake. It is hardly imaginable to see a peace process re-emerging because of Israeli domestic politics, because of the elections in America, because of so many other issues related to Israel and Palestine's neighbors. And if one starts off with the premise that the only peace can happen once this imaginable two-state solution comes to pass. I personally believe that the only solution is a two-state solution at some point in the future. Well, that is not going to happen in 2024. We're not even going to have like a start of this in 2004. And then with this expected change in government in America, I don't think that 2025 or 2026 are going to be that much better. But, you know, that's too far away, so I'm not going to go that far, and at least not in my opening remarks. And then the third thing, the third crisis of 2004 that is not going to go in a way that most people here, I think, would be prepared to applaud or cheer, is the war in Ukraine. I fail to see how this situation gets better, at least from the perspective of Ukraine and Ukraine's allies in 2024. Going back to the first topic, which was American politics, if there is this expected outcome that Donald Trump becomes president of the becomes nominee of the GOP, let's say nominee of the GOP in a few weeks from now, forget about Congress passing the bill that leads to support of Ukraine in terms of military support and financial support and, you know, the big package that is currently being blocked in the Congress. There are some chances that this passes through in the coming 10 days or 2 weeks. If it doesn't happen in the next 2 weeks, I'm prepared to bet that it is not going to happen at all. If that doesn't happen, I'd be exceptionally worried if I were in a government in Kiev. Not just in terms of if I'd be able to regain the territory that was lost to the Russian military since the beginning of the 2022 invasion and the 2014 annexation of Crimea. I become to be worried about whether the current territory can be held and what will be the future of that conflict. So I fear that the 2024 is going to be the year of partition of Ukraine. Something that is not a matter of personal preference. This is not something I believe we should want or pray for or hope for. But I think it is based on the facts on the ground. And the question is how we, and when I say we, I refer to Collective West, how we going to deal with it so that it doesn't exacerbate suffering and it leads to an outcome that in the future may be geostrategically and geopolitically acceptable by us. Now, speaking about acceptable things, you know, there's so many things that are not acceptable and that are happening anyhow. I don't know if Assad is acceptable. I remember I was president of the General Assembly at a time when Barack Obama said that it's completely unacceptable that Assad stays in office. That was back in 2012 and 2013. Still in office. I remember a lot of people saying that the North Korean nuclear weapons are unacceptable, but they're there. Maduro is unacceptable in Venezuela. There are a number of unacceptable things. And I understand why somebody who's doing a very unpleasant work of, running Ukraine's government, any department of the government would find partition of Ukraine unacceptable. But that's the 2024 for you. And 2025 might be worse, because there may be changes in America and other places. So those three things, those three crises are the crises that are gonna, in my opinion, be the top things of 2024. And to end on a somewhat brighter note, I'd say that not everything's terrible, not everything is pessimistic. I think that there are a lot of things that will be okay in 2004. And for instance, the most geopolitical relationship in the world of our times, for sure, which is the US-China relationship, I think it's not gonna get worse in 2024. I think that there is a very strong incentive by both sides that this thing is kept in check. For years, the US-China relationship has been in a managed decline, with an emphasis on decline. I think that the 2024 is going to be the emphasis on managed. So that's good news. That's really good news. That's very important. It's important for the world's economy. It's important for everybody, right? That perhaps can open up some doors for some kind of understanding in September in New York, where the Secretary General of the United Nations has called for a UN summit for the future, summit of the future for 2024, when countries are going to get together and try and start a process of coming to an agreement on some kind of regulation for issues like artificial intelligence, biotech, issues that have not been successfully regulated, even at the national level, let alone international level. But in this teeth of a geopolitical recession, there is this meeting of 2024, the meeting at the UN on the margins of the General Assembly. And from what I observe, both US and China are very keen that this yields a success. So not everything is bad, not everything is lost. There are going to be, by the way, a number of elections around the world. I think only the American election is problematic. Admittedly, a very important one. But there are a number of other momentous elections. There's going to be an election in India. There's going to be an election in Europe. You're at the level of the European Union. There's going to be an election in Mexico. I wouldn't be overly worried about those elections. When I say I wouldn't be overly worried, I don't think that the result of the outcome of those elections are going to lead to negative externalities or overly negative externalities for the planet. American election, it probably will, regardless of who wins. And that's the problem. But I'll end here, and I hope I did not overrun too much.
Not at all. Thank you. So, building on the three crises you spoke about the extraordinary violence that's happening in both Ukraine and Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I was wondering, as a former president of the UN General Assembly, indeed the youngest president of the UN General Assembly in its history, which of those two instances of violence, horrific violence, do you think poses more of a fundamental challenge for the United Nations as an institution, and why?
Middle East by far. In the Middle East, this is it's so impossible to come up with a semi-meaningful way forward, being completely mindful of the circumstances, not trying to ignore, not trying to wish away the politics of, Israel, or not trying to wish away Turkey or anything, right? Just trying to be very realistic, it is not possible to imagine anything leading to normalcy. And what's the UN for if it's impossible to play a role there? And this defunding of the UN agency responsible, basically, for distributing aid in Palestine, UNRWC. I mean, people like corner themselves like by making this decision to defund, and there's no way back. I mean, how can American government decide to go back on this in the elections year? It means that the UN is basically going to become deeply dysfunctional in the context of Palestine. I mean, it's going to be a big hit on UN's credibility. And I think it's unfair because it's not UN's fault. I always like to say when people are bragging about the United Nations and how ineffective the United Nations is, it's like, you know what, guys, it's like giving hard time to the management of the Madison Square Garden for the poor performance of Knicks, of New York Knicks. It's not the fault of the Madison Square Garden. United Nations is the club of member states. It's a venue. They're providing like a place where, we can meet and discuss and debate. Like, it's not the UN's fault. It's the fault of the member states. And of course, the more powerful the member states, the more responsible they are for both good and bad things that are happening in the club. But I think that the institution is such, and the idea of a multilateralism, an idea of multilateralist forum, where you're supposed to debate this and discuss this under the rules defined by the UN Charter, which envisages veto powers for those who have it and so on and so forth. And the failure of come to the fruition the Palestinian state, which is something guaranteed by the resolutions of the United Nations since 1948, right? It's not going to help. It's not going to help the credibility of the United Nations. And in the case of Ukraine, again, there was a clear violation of the UN Charter. The first violation of the UN Charter of that sort in 2022. But in the past, there were similar violations of the UN Charter conducted by different actors. So that is something that is viewed, at least in the vast majority of world countries, viewed as a less of a tragedy than the tragedy of the Palestinian people and tragedy of Israel and Palestine. Of course, at the same time, not being able to come to peace and not being able to come to peace probably for many, many more years to come.
So building on multilateralism that you've spoken about, and also going back to your time as the President of the UN General Assembly, I believe that during your time there you had played a facilitative role in the Arms Trade Treaty of 2013. Yeah. And it's been 11 years since that treaty was negotiated. What aspect, have you seen any aspects of that treaty play out in the conflicts you discussed? And how do you relate the kind of multilateral treaty negotiation 11 years ago? How do you kind of square that with the violence that we're seeing now in the case studies that you spoke about?
I remember,
Is that a fair question?
Every question is a fair question at the Cambridge Union. So I remember everybody being so enthusiastic about this arms trade treaty breakthrough. I was president of the General Assembly. I led the negotiations. I have to say, I'm not to claim credit about this. It was part of a bigger, I would say, sentiment of like, yeah, let's work together to come to agreement. It was part of the different cycle of geopolitics, the good cycle of geopolitics leading to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and agreeing on a Paris Climate Treaty, and ATT was a part of this. And we had a different American administration, very different from now, and a differently minded Chinese administration, and different kind of situation in Europe and even in Russia at that time. But anyway, the way the treaty was negotiated was that in the end, the actors who were sticking out felt like it was part of a bigger deal to come to an agreement. And always the question is whether the parties are going to respect or honor what they signed. It was like only a few years later that the ATT is essentially not being honored by a number of parties. And they wouldn't admit this to you into your face to say, oh, we're violating the Arms Trade Treaty, but the Arms Trade Treaty is like violated in Yemen. And everybody knows this, that the Arms Trade Treaty is violated in Yemen by more than one side. And people know that the Arms Trade Treaty is violated in Africa. And to be honest, the Arms Trade Treaty is being violated in Ukraine, if you want to strictly interpret international law. But, you know, politics win over international law. National politics and geopolitical considerations, they win over global common interests and delivering global goods. And this is one of the aspects, this is one of the characteristics of the geopolitical recession. When you are in a geopolitical recession, then every nation is for itself, or a group of nations. So maybe one thing to consider is many-lateralism as opposed to multilateralism under the circumstances if one wants to be realistic and want to achieve international cooperation, despite the fact that the greatest of players are not, you know, seeing eye to eye with each other.
Indeed. And you spoke about America and American populism, and it's your belief that Donald Trump may well win the 2024 election.
Yeah.
And I'd like to relate this to your time as foreign minister, because you were foreign minister between 2007 and 2012, during there was both the Bush and Obama administration.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, you know, this was a time where it was the aftermath of the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. The Great Recession had come about. There was growing polarization in America at the time. Could you anticipate from that vantage point as foreign minister during that crucial period where, in hindsight, a lot of the very worst impetuses that led to populism began to come into play? Could you anticipate at that point just how bad the situation would become?
Look, I'd come across as bragging and, like, you know, being a smartass if I said that, like, yes, I did. I was actually saying this to my interlocutors. I was trying to point to the fact that, you know, things are really not going in a right direction. And despite the fact that everybody thought that, oh my God, this is going to last forever, the good times, the globalization, we'll continue going to Davos every year and discuss things there as opposed to the UN General Assembly. And who cares if there's like a misunderstanding, one or two misunderstandings here and there. We're going to iron it out at Davos, right? I thought that this was not going to work out well. Maybe I was in a better position to see that because I was a foreign minister of Serbia. And 2008 was an exceptionally complicated year for Serbia. It was the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo. And the job of the Serbian government and Minister of Foreign Affairs in particular was to oppose this, what we viewed as unilateral attempt at secession. And I was trying to explain to people, my interlocutors around the world, that this was a very dangerous precedent that could, be very well used by someone else in the future, and it doesn't really matter if it completely is identical, or like different, but will be used by other people. So I'll share with you this anecdote. This is not the first time that I'm saying it. I said it at the BBC, so everybody knows it already. I was a young foreign minister in Washington trying to talk the United States government out of pushing for the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo. Because I thought this was going to be very bad for the region. This was going to be the precedent that somebody else was going to use at some point, inevitably, right? And I had a conversation at that time with Condoleezza Rice. She was Secretary of State at that time. She was my counterpart. I was at that time the youngest foreign minister in the world, and I must say that she was actually very friendly. She was very considerate, and I happened to have a better conversation and a better relationship with her than with her successor, which was Hillary Clinton. So I remember explaining to her, as foreign minister of Serbia, why I thought that this was a big mistake, that they support Kosovo going for a unilaterally declared independence, that I think this was going to create trouble. And she was kind of listening, and she was like prepared to take arguments. She was intellectually honest, I think. Mm. But then at some point, because our meeting was coming to an end, she said, Mr. Minister, I know I hear you, but I got to tell you, Kosovo is a special case. And I said, before we go any further, could you tell me who has the right to declare special cases? I mean, you obviously have the right to declare a special case because you just are, but who else? I mean, do the Russians have also the right, the permanent 5 members, for instance, of the Security Council, are they the ones who have the right to declare special cases? And she's like, didn't answer. I said, okay, but can you tell me what makes it so special? What is so special about Kosovo? And she said to me, and I remember this very well, she said, you had an exceptionally brutal dictatorship which oppressed an ethnic minority to the point of extreme. It brought about international intervention, and although this dictator is dead and your country is now a democracy, 99% of people who live in this territory, they no longer want to be a part of your country. So there's basically nothing you can do to stop it. And I said to her, well, pardon me, Madam Secretary, you're now talking about Iraq. She said, what? Well, it was a very brutal dictatorship, right? That was oppressing, actually gassing an ethnic minority to the point of extreme. Saddam is dead. Iraq is, you say, democracy. And 99% of Kurds want to break away from Iraq. And does this mean that the United States is going to support the independent state of Kurdistan? Or maybe what you're trying to say is that Saddam was a good guy in comparison to Milosevic, so that Serbia needs to be punished for the misdeeds of the deceased dictator, whereas Iraq was not. And she's like, oh, Mr. Minister, these are totally different things. I said, well, maybe. But what are you going to do tomorrow when somebody else does the same thing? And declare that this is our version of truth and this is what we're going to do. I think you're going to find it very, very difficult to argue against this. And actually, it took 3 months. It was like 4 months after this conversation that Russian troops invaded Georgia, and the whole thing was repeated by the South Ossetian and Abkhazian government, and Russians recognizing the independence of these states. And it doesn't really matter that the rest of the world was saying, no, 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 this is not the same, you cannot do that. It was a very, very dangerous precedent. Now, to come to a conclusion, I thought back then that things were not going to end too well if there's this continued ignorance of people's fears, security issues, beliefs, trusts, and the like. So for me, this is not surprising. But for most people at that time who were in my position, yeah, I guess that with the benefit of hindsight, they'd say, we're surprised.
You paint a vivid portrait of that conversation. And I think on that, it's time to open up to a few audience questions.
Now,
So,
this is the most difficult part, I was told.
yes, just there, please.
Sure.
Oh, just wait for the mic.
Thank you. Is it working? Thank you very much for your time today. You mentioned that it's not the UN's fault, and I was wondering...
It's not the UN's
fault.
Sure.
I was wondering, is the UN Security Council veto anti-democratic? And secondly, if the end of history is an illusion, what's the point? Thank you.
I mean, it's completely not democratic, the veto in the Security Council, but that's the way things are. This is the international order that we have. It's based on the results of the Second World War, and the founding fathers of the United Nations came up with this formula that worked reasonably well for a number of decades. One can argue that following the end of the Second World War, this was by far the most peaceful era in human history, despite the tragedies of Korea, Vietnam, parts of Africa, and so on and so forth. Arguably, the decades following the end of the Second World War were, one of the best eras in human history. People getting out of poverty, number of people, huge parts of humanity coming out of poverty and the like. The problem with international institutions is that they're usually well defined and engineered at the time when this is being drawn. And then the life goes on, the situation develops around the world, and the institutions stay, cemented in that period. And there's if the structure of an institution is such that the incumbents do not have the motivation to change them, and obviously the permanent 5 members of the Security Council do not have a direct incentive to change it, because it would amount to them losing power, then institutions tend to come into crisis after a while. I personally think that when you create an international treaty or an international institutions, that you should always make a sunset clause, in a sense that it ends at a certain point, and that gives the incentive to people to come to another agreement, because they know that if they do not come to an agreement, nothing will exist. Right now, there is an asymmetrical set of incentives. And this is why I think it is unrealistic to expect that that institution is going to change in a sense that the vetoes are given up. But it's got to be addressed. Because if it is not addressed, in 5 to 10 years from now, there'll be no more United Nations, in my opinion, and most people are aware of this acute condition. So what I'd propose to the Summit of the Future and to the Secretary General of the United Nations, who I respect dearly, Antonio Guterres, is that another chamber of the United Nations is introduced, in which nations would be represented according to the size of their population. That's a bit more democratic. You keep the General Assembly where there's like a one nation, one vote. You keep the Security Council because you cannot dissolve it. It's impossible to dissolve it. But you introduce another chamber in which there's a proportionality related to the population. And then it brings the idea of democracy, a little bit more democracy into it, as a passing stage on to a more profound reform. And a more profound reform would probably come after a disaster of some sort, because it usually necessitates, unfortunately, a disaster for a significant reform of the international governance is taking place. I thought for a moment that COVID was going to be this opportunity when people realized that things are very bad, but that opportunity was missed. So we'll have to wait for a cyber attack or something of a sizable consequence.
Just there at the front, please.
Thank you very much for coming to speak today. I wanted to ask you about how you see British-Serbian relations changing going forward. I'm sure you're aware of the controversy late last year with our Foreign Affairs Select Committee Chair, Alicia Kearns, with accusations of arms being smuggled into Kosovo from Serbia. So I just wondered how you see these sort of tensions being diffused in the future so we can have more constructive conversations, and what you think standing in the way of that, those sort of tensions at the minute. Thank you.
I wouldn't, give it flying collar marks, the relations between the United Kingdom and Serbia right now, and I think it's not very likely to change for the better, because every story needs a villain, and Serbia is such a good villain in the UK discourse. Actually, vice versa as well. The UK is such a perfect villain if you're looking at the things from Serbia. And I think that in Serbia, we have a very particular form of governance right now in which villains are needed. And I think that the UK is fulfilling this role reasonably well for the government of Serbia right now. The government of Serbia did not introduce sanctions in Russia, as the only government probably in Europe that did not introduce sanctions in Russia. It'd be difficult to imagine them introducing sanctions in Russia in a country where 75% of public believes this was not going to be a good thing. It'd be very difficult for any government in Serbia to do that, and that kind of comes as a perfect way to bash such a government. If you're sitting in London, if you're running the UK government, then of course Serbia, with that government, would be a villain. With the unresolved issue of Kosovo, when when Russia is the biggest supporter in the Security Council, basically using the power of veto to prevent Kosovo from becoming a member state of the United Nations, and therefore having infinite amount of soft power for free, basically, and in Serbia. So this ongoing tragedy and this unfolding tragedy in Ukraine, which I believe is going to continue unfolding in 2024, as I said, is probably not going to make up for a set of conditions in which improving of the relations between the UK and Serbia is easily imagined. Now, on the bright side, we have a very pragmatic government. So doing business is something that I can easily imagine being done, you know, with British firms, financial companies, right, and the like. So I'm an optimist when it comes to economic cooperation. I'm not so much of an optimist when it comes to political cooperation. But this is just my observing and not being able to influence all that much the course of events.
Just there, please.
Thank you. Mr. Jeremić, you started by noting anniversary of yours. I would like to join sort of the anniversary train and say that this month marks 25 years since 45 Albanians were taken out of their homes in a small village of Rečak and killed by Serbian troops. In Serbia today, this is considered a conspiracy theory, and this is the stance of the Serbian state, the same state that you serve, and the same state that killed 13,000 civilians in 98-99, raped thousands of women in 98-99, and forced 1 million Albanians out of their home, including my family, by the way. I haven't heard an apology from the Serbian state. You certainly haven't issued one during your time as foreign minister, and you talk of Milosevic as this great outlier. Oh, he was the crazy dictator. He was our Saddam. Now we don't have anything like that. Well, that's clearly not true, because if you look at Serbia before Milosevic, for as long as Kosovo has been occupied by Serbia, these plans of exterminating Albanians have existed. Read Čubrilović, read Andrić. And if you look at Serbia since Milosevic, since he killed himself, you have had sort of please let me finish 2 sentences. You have had sort of fashionable nationalists who say, oh, we don't like Milosevic, but spew the same nonsense about Kosovo. And then you have people like the guy who's been running the government for the last 10 years, who's literally a disciple of Milosevic. The guy was Minister of Information in Milosevic's government. I'm sorry, this is just ridiculous.
So what was exactly the question?
The question is, how do you respond to these facts? Because I believe that there is such a thing as truth. Maybe you can say that, oh, these 744 people found in Batajnica who were killed in Kosovo and driven hundreds of kilometers all the way up to Serbia, maybe they drove themselves to Serbia and lied dead. Maybe that's your version of truth, since we want to make it all relative. But my question is, how do you reconcile with these facts?
Well, thank you for the question. And this is a very good example of why I believe it is very important to define the truth in a proper way as a sum of facts and context. So truth is not equal facts. Facts are such that are telling a certain story. But in order to understand the truth, one needs to also understand the context. The context has to do with historical narratives, with the historical building up of how we came to a certain situation. The beginning, when we were talking about the end of history, but one can also talk about the beginning of history. Where does the history actually begins? And the pendulum swings from one side to another throughout history. I personally think that the crimes committed in the Balkans in the 90s were terrible and not to be defended in any possible way, but that they have not been committed by exclusively one side. And that the truth is actually very different when viewed in the context of somebody who had a family who was abducted and killed and sent into the collective grave in Batajnica, or a family of somebody who was abducted and then his organs taken out and sold on the black market, which was happening to a lot of,
Any evidence of that?
to which happened to a number of.
I'm sorry, there's no evidence.
I would
Any
disagree.
party made a report that led to a special court, and that special court has no evidence of any of that happening. So that's just propaganda.
Well, allow me to disagree with you, because the way I understand the truth is that this was very much the case. So what I'm saying is that in order to come to historical reconciliation, which I think it's always something that we need to strive for, be it in the Balkans or in the Middle East or in Ukraine or anywhere else in the world, I think we should try and do a better job of trying to understand the other people's version of truth. And if we really want peace, to work for that by not dismissing other people's deep feelings and sentiments. One of the aspects of the Kosovo, past, present, and future, is that most of us in Serbia, including myself, consider this to be the holiest place of Serbian existence, the birthplace of Serbian state, the birthplace of Serbian church, the birthplace of everything that we feel about ourselves as having a national identity.
Can't.
Well, this is not a debate. Well, I completely understand, and
After
Well,
this, we need to move on to another question.
and I'm
enable
gonna
members of
end
the
with
audience
this.
to speak.
It's precisely because you're calling somebody's deep sentiments a BS, is that we're not moving fast enough toward a sustainable peace in the Balkans. I tell you, I firmly believe, and most of my compatriots do, that the gist of Serbian national identity is intimately related to the place where we are from, which is Kosovo. Now, in Palestine or in Israel, I can also understand that there are people who have different understandings of history and the present. But in order to move beyond divisions, in order to try and live next to each other peacefully, I think we'd be better advised if we were not to call other people's sentiments and beliefs a BS. But that's maybe just me saying things.
Just at the front there.
Thank you for being with us here today. Just a really sort of brief question. I'm curious how you didn't, sort of define the upcoming Indian election as one of sort of to be concerned about, nor the recent Taiwanese election. I just wondered if you could sort of discuss with us a bit more about that. Thank you.
I think that the Taiwanese elections went the way it was always going to go. And I'm an optimist in terms of the outcome of this election, in the sense that there's going to be rational leadership in Taipei, which is, now that the elections are over, the campaign is over. I think that the wider understanding is that it's not the time to to cross the red lines of any sort in the Strait or in East Asia in particular. Of course, this is not to say that things cannot get risky and slippery. But something's telling me, I'm actually following very closely the politics of Taiwan, believe it or not. I think it's going to be okay. I think that now that we are beyond the election, that things are going to be fine. What happens in 2025 and 2026 in the context of the cross-strait relations, I think it's going to be much more a function of the relationship between the Trump presidency and China, or in the potential Trump presidency, which I think is likely, and China in terms of whether or not they come and they land at some sort of a deal, which is unimaginable with this kind of administration. But Modi, with Indian election, which I think is more or less a shoo-in. I mean, right now, 75% approval rate, and of course they have a first past the post and the various provinces and so on and so forth, so we may not talk about the absolute majority, but I think it's going to be a majority. I think that the focus of the third Modi government, the third Modi term in office, at least from what I hear and learn from my contacts in the Indian government, and I have many friends who are in the Indian government, the focus is going to be economy and economic legacy. Of course, things can go off the rail. Things in Pakistan can go off the rail. I mean, things can happen. We talked about the black swans and so on and so forth. But, if you put things in perspective, I'm far more worried about the American election than the Indian election. In the Indian election, there is at least a very high degree of predictability and certainty, and you may like or you may not so much like what's going to be the outcome, but there's like predictability and certainty. In American election, there's very little predictability. Not like just like who's going to win, but like, as I said, like if the result of the election is going to be accepted by the losing side and how they're going to then play with the electoral college and whether the governors are going to be sending, delegates who are going to vote this way or that way. I mean, the whole political system is in a deep crisis in America. It's not so much in India. And of course, there are problems in India, and especially dealing with Muslims and with Pakistan, not just with Pakistan, but with the Muslim population in general, and that's a thing to be watched. But I wouldn't bet on this exploding in 2024. For 2024, I predict Modi's hands-down victory and the creation of a new cabinet with most of the people who have been occupying posts in the government keeping their position.
And just one last question from the audience. Should we go there?
Hi, thank you for your time. I just wanted to return to the discussion that was being had previously on the topic of the conflict in the Middle East and the United Nations. In particular, I was wondering if you had any insights you could share about the recent ruling of the ICJ.
ICJ.
Thank you.
It's a very interesting development. The ICJ, I have some experience with the ICJ. Serbia was working with the ICJ at certain point in the context of Kosovo. There was discussion there. ICJ is not like your perfect independent court in which there are no political considerations inside the process. And the judges, at the end of the day, they need to talk to each other, and they need to agree on what they're going to vote for and how they're going to phrase things and the like. But I think the mere case, the mere thing that it happened, was profoundly important. And the fact that it was South Africa, not any other country, it was South Africa that actually brought the case to the court. South Africa that has the history of, apartheid, and it's very, very difficult to, affect the credibility of South Africa when it comes to ethnic or racial oppression, given the history of South Africa. I think it was a show of the global public opinion on the case. The fact that the court, I knew that there was never a chance in the world that the court was going to order Israel to halt operations. Because this is simply geopolitically not viable. It would be a naive thing. In my opinion, it would be the right thing to do, but it was just not possible under the geopolitical circumstances. But the fact that South Africa brought it, and that the large swaths of the global South supported this wholeheartedly, made America far more isolated on the international scene than just the unpleasant experience of sitting in the Security Council and vetoing a resolution, because this is what America does all the time. America is used to vetoing resolutions related to the Middle East, just like Russia is used to vetoing resolutions that are not to their liking. But this is like a known thing. This ICJ case brought about by South Africa, in which there is an implicit saying that genocidal intentions might be around, hanging in the air at least. I think it's a very, very severe warning for the protagonists of this war, that the international public opinion is going to continue going in a direction that is probably not to the liking of the United States. And hence, I expect that if things do not somehow miraculously come to a halt, which I said at the beginning I don't expect this is going to happen, they'll bring about more radicalization of the Arab world, of the Muslim world in general, and that we may witness trouble, not necessarily only in the region, but in the wider region. And maybe here, maybe in the West, maybe during the Olympics in Paris. I think it'll be a challenging year for us, 2024.
So I just had one last question to finish off this evening. And what it's in kind of relation to is it sort of draws together what you're saying about America, your time as President of the UN General Assembly, and the ongoing crises at the minute. And I hope that it kind of captures an insight into some of those. So my question is that during your time as President of the UN General Assembly, it's my understanding that you've played an important role in giving Palestine non-observer status.
Yep.
And I wanted to kind of talk about how was doing that in your capacity as the President of the UN General Assembly, how did that affect your relationship with the American officials you're interacting with? And what does that say about the broader geopolitics of Palestine, Israel, and America?
I was the first president of the General Assembly of the United Nations that actually dared putting the vote on Palestine, the vote on membership of Palestine. Of course, not the full membership, because the full membership in the United Nations necessitates, according to the Charter, first and foremost, the vote in the Security Council and then in the General Assembly. So this was like for an observer state, not member, observer state status. But and for that, Palestine always had numbers. But it was never put down for a vote. And you know, one of the powers of the office of the President of the General Assembly is that you can actually decide what is put down for a vote and what's not put down for a vote. And I actually used my power as President of the General Assembly to put it down for a vote. And there was like tremendous pressure on me exercised by the United States, first and foremost. That,
If I can ask, what does that look like, exerting pressure?
You know, you get to be called and, you know, ask for a meeting with the American ambassador, and she asks to be along with you and tells you how things can progress negatively in your career.
Start.
And by the way, it happened because the person who was telling me this, her name was Susan Rice. She was American ambassador to the UN at that time. And then a few years later, I was running for office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And you know what? Like, Susan Rice was the National Security Advisor of President Obama at that time. She was actually deciding how America was going to vote on my candidacy. And, you know, guess what? I didn't win. I got a veto from the United States. So then things happen. I mean, you know, you decide that you want to be independent-minded and put things for a vote and believe in democracy, and it comes at a price. It happened in my case, for sure. So this is my personal experience. But in general, pressures can be even worse than that.
And I think that's a sobering and insightful point.
You know what, like I'm running, just this to finish off, I'm running this, I'm teaching a course at Sciences Po in Paris, at the Paris School of International Affairs. It's called Introduction to Contemporary Geopolitics, a Practitioner's View. And, you know, I've got brilliant students in the class, 24 of them I had last semester, and I ran a simulation, basically, with them in which 4 students were candidates for Secretary General, and the rest of the class was divided up in 15 member states of the Security Council, and all of them received instructions from their capitals. Like, I and my teaching assistants were writing these instructions as to how to go about these election procedures. So I shared with them how it actually works in practice and how they blackmail you and what they say and when they say the truth and when they not say the truth, and the latter is, you know, far more frequent than the former, and this is how things works in international organizations. But I shared with them this experience of mine with personal relations that matter, both positively and negatively, when it comes to elections.
Well, I was going to say that's a sobering and fascinating point to, I think, end the discussion for this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremić.
Thank you.